If you guys haven't already, go check out part 1 of this series. If you have or don't care, let's get on with the show. Well, 1995 ended off pretty rough, but hopefully 1996 is better. First on the chopping block is the arcade game Sonic the Fighters, called Sonic Championship in North America, released in May of 1996. You've probably never heard it called Sonic Championship since the arcade cabinet was apparently extremely rare, so I'm sure most people are more familiar with this game via the Gems collection and the 2012 version. Sonic the Fighters was actually made by the same team who worked on Virtua Fighter, Sega AM2, a division of Sega focused primarily on developing arcade games. In fact, it used an engine based on Virtua Fighter 2, or at least a modified version of it. Sega AM2 was working on another fighting game called Fighting Vipers, another game based on Virtua Fighter 2, which was an attempt to make a fighting game that could appeal to Western audiences, as Virtua Fighter, while successful, never quite blew up the same way it did in Japan. So in a sense, Sonic the Fighters is a mod of a mod. One of the weirdest things about Fighting Vipers is that in the Japanese Sega Saturn port of the game, they added a new secret character, Pepsi Man. He was Pepsi Japan's mascot character in the mid-90s who ran around giving thirsty people in need a refreshing can of Pepsi. In part 1 of this series, I mentioned how Sega worked with Coca-Cola with their 2002 Sonic Golf C Mode Cup game. So somehow, Sega managed to work on video games with the two biggest soda companies on the planet. This wasn't even the first time Sega worked with Coca-Cola. In 1994, a game called Saso Shonen Eiyuden Coca-Cola Kid was released for the Game Gear. They even had a special red Coca-Cola branded Game Gear that came bundled with the game in a special red cartridge. Is it soulless company marketing? Oh, absolutely. But that cherry red Game Gear is spicy. The funniest part of this is the team who developed the game, Aspect, the same guys who made the Sonic Game Gear games. Sonic just has a way of bringing people together, doesn't he? But anyway, back to Sonic the Fighters. While working on Fighting Vipers, one of the programmers in typical Sonic fan fashion was goofing off on company time and put Sonic and Tails in the game. Producer and Sega legend Yu Suzuki, who directed Virtua Fighter, was impressed with this concept. So after bringing the idea to Fighting Vipers director Hiroshi Kataoka and getting approval from Yuji Naka himself, one of the creators of Sonic the Hedgehog, the idea for a Sonic fighting game was greenlit. Apparently Yuji Naka was skeptical because he thought Sonic's head was too big and his arms were too stubby to even fight. But they managed to find a way to get it to work. Not only is this the first Sonic fighting game, it's the first 3D Sonic game. This game predates Sonic Adventure, Sonic Jam, Sonic 3D Blast if you want to be a weirdo and count that game. It's the first time we got Sonic as a real-time 3D polygonal model. Despite being low poly, visually, this game is great. It has a ton of personality. The game has a real cartoony look to it thanks to the use of squash and stretch to give each attack a ton of emphasis. Sega was so proud of themselves for these graphics that they got a legal patent for the specific techniques that they use to animate these characters. But hey, I can't blame them. All the characters in this game look really cool. We got your typical guys like Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles, but we've also got Espio from the Chaotix and a handful of original characters. Bean the Dynamite, who was based on the main character from an old 1989 Sega AM2 beat-em-up game, Dynamite Ducks, and Bark the Polar Bear. We wouldn't see these guys ever again in a Sonic game until they reappeared in Sonic Mania. However, they did appear in Fighters Megamix on the Sega Saturn at the end of '96. Fighters Megamix was a crossover fighting game featuring characters from several Sega AM2 games like Virtua Fighter, Fighting Vipers, and Sonic the Fighters. Seeing Bark and Bean in this game is just so weird. Next to the more realistic characters, they look like dudes wearing mascot costumes. Oh, and you can also play as a car. The 2012 updated version on PSN and Xbox Live added in Metal Sonic and Eggman, who I thought were strangely absent from the original release's roster despite being boss characters. The 2012 version also added in Honey the Cat, a cat version of a character from Fighting Vipers who was originally in the first version of Sonic the Fighters but for some reason was cut before release. So hey, Sega had their own Smash Bros before Nintendo. But what's even more hilarious is that the Sega crossover didn't have Sonic, but Nintendo's did. Back to Sonic the Fighters, Amy's in this game too, and this game marks the first appearance of her iconic Pico Pico hammer. Gameplay wise, I was like, if you want to play this game, find some buddies to duke it out with. If you don't have any friends, figure something out, because playing this game single player is not the way to go. As with, well, any fighting game really, you just don't get the full experience. The game actually has some really cool mechanics, like a shield meter that's gone for the rest of the entire match if it gets destroyed, so the game encourages more offensive, fast-paced combat. There's also a sidestep that can help you dodge attacks and circle around your opponent. Each character has their own unique abilities, and there's some cool combos you can do too. But you don't really get to experience many of this game's strengths if you're just fighting against the AIs in single player where you can just spam the same move over and over and win. I don't think this game is a masterpiece. It's a pretty simple game, and I definitely play other fighting games, even other fighting games released this year over Sonic the Fighters. But if you do get a chance to play this game online or over a friend's house or even at an arcade, I'd say go for it. It's got a lot of charm. And you can play as Fang the Sniper. Our next game is a trip to a non-Sega system with Sonic Schoolhouse, released only in America on Windows PC.
Hi there, I'm Sonic the Hedgehog. You're going to play in my schoolhouse.
Like Tales and the Music Maker, this is another edutainment game made for kids. And in this game, you have to go around this schoolhouse solving various different questions about math and spelling and stuff. This game may look familiar if you've kept up with popular indie games in the last few years. Sonic Schoolhouse was the inspiration for the indie horror game Baldi's Basics, created by Mistman12, where you have to run away from this evil teacher who wants to kill you for getting a math question wrong. Other than that though, there's nothing really notable about this game, other than the nightmare-inducing friends that Sonic has. Next is Sonic 3D Blast, aka Sonic 3D Flicky's Island outside of America, released on both the new Sega Saturn system and the Sega Genesis in November '96. However, strangely, Japan would not get this game until 1999. This game is an isometric 2D game, despite the big, This game's visuals are more along the lines of Donkey Kong Country, making use of pre-rendered 3D graphics and turning them into 2D sprites. This game, from a technical standpoint, was amazing for the Genesis. On the Saturn, not so much. It being on the Genesis was quite strange considering we were already well into the Saturn's lifespan. I figured maybe they put the game on the Genesis just to give people who hadn't switched over yet to the new system a chance to play the game. In reality though, the Genesis version was actually designed first. There was another Sonic game going through development issues that was supposed to be released in '96, and since the world just could not go on without a new Sonic game on the Saturn, in typical Sega fashion, they decided to rush out a game for the holiday season. While Sonic Team did help by designing this game, they weren't available to develop it as they've been working on their new game for the Saturn, Nights into Dreams. Funnily enough, Nights into Dreams was only Sonic Team's second game. While Yuji Naka and Hirokazu Yasuhara did work on Sonic 2, 3, and Knuckles, technically they were all developed by the Sega Technical Institute led by Mark Cerny, which they were a part of while working in America. Plus, Naoto Oshima, the last member of the Big Three in Sonic Team, was back in Japan working with a separate crew on Sonic CD. So despite all of the people involved having made several Sonic games at this point, this would only be their second game as Sonic Team. And it wasn't even a Sonic game! While Sonic Team did provide assistance, like I said, the main developers of this game were Traveller's Tales, a British studio who made a name for themselves working on games for Disney like Mickey Mania and Toy Story. They went on to have a very prolific career developing the LEGO series of games. Initially, Traveller's Tales turned down Sega when they were asked to make a new game for the Genesis, but when they found out it was a Sonic game? Birth of your first child, who cares? We gotta make this Sonic game hot! The music for this game is pretty jammin', both versions. Because, yeah, the Genesis and Saturn versions had entirely different soundtracks from one another. The Genesis version's soundtrack was composed primarily by a duo of Tatsuyuki Maeda and the leader of Crush 40, Jun Sonoe. The Saturn version was composed by Richard Jakes, who's worked on tons of other Sega games like Sonic Generations, Sonic and the Black Knight, and Jet Set Radio, plus one other game we'll be looking at today later. As for how good this game is, it's not terrible, it's just kind of annoying. It's a collectathon where you have to find flickies, which are these little birds, by destroying enemies. You bring 5 flickies to a warp ring and you can move on to the next area. That's the entire game. There's bosses and special stages, but they seem like more of a formality than anything else. Exploration has obviously been a part of Sonic since the beginning, but this is just a bit too far. The isometric view also makes it very difficult to control, especially when you have to make tight jumps. Our last stop in 1996 is the last Sonic game released for the Game Gear and the last Game Gear game, period, in Japan. Sonic Blast. In Japan, this game is known as G-Sonic, released as a part of their Kids Gear brand, which I guess were games that were targeted towards young kids. There's a Virtua Fighter mini Game Gear released under this label, and while a bit too flashy for my taste, it is pretty cool. So, Sonic Blast, it exists, I think. When I search it up on Google, I get the drive-in restaurant, but if we scroll down a little bit, there we go. This Game Gear game was once again developed by Aspect. Like 3D Blast, it also uses pre-rendered 3D graphics, and man, are they something. From a technical standpoint, it was very impressive for the Game Gear, yes, but it just does not look good. It's considered to be one of the worst Sonic games due to its poor level design and the small screen of the Game Gear making it really difficult to see. Although it is notable in that it was the first game in the series to allow Sonic to double jump naturally without a power-up. This technique would become a standard move in Sonic's arsenal later in his 3D career. Well, 1996 sure was a blast, but onwards to 1997. And first up we have Sonic's Bonus Game, a web browser flash game put on Sega's official website. They had browser games for other titles too, like apparently there was a Knights one and one for Worldwide Soccer 97. Sonic's Bonus Game was a flash game based on the Genesis version of Sonic 3D Blast Special Stages. Back when the internet was first starting to become commonplace, companies would make these silly little online games to promote their products, and usually they were pretty jank. Give an intern a monster in 4 hours and just throw whatever they made up on the site. Next up is one of the more notable games from this era, Sonic Jam, released in June of 1997. This was the first Sonic game directed by Takashi Iizuka, who would later direct the adventure games and has continued playing a huge role in the Sonic series even to this day. Sonic Jam is a collection of Sonic 1, 2, 3, and Knuckles for the Saturn. Considering the Genesis games were only about 5 years old at this point, having them all in one collection was pretty sweet. The game's name has always struck me as kinda weird. Sonic Mega Collection? It's a big collection of the Mega Drive games, yeah, that makes sense. Sonic Origins? It's a collection of the original Sonic games, yeah, okay. Sonic Jam? Yeah, I have no idea. Apparently, the game's name was pitched by Satoshi Okano, one of the artists who worked on the game. He came up with the idea for Sonic Jam being the name after being inspired by 90s hip-hop groups like A Tribe Called Quest, Public Enemy, and De La Soul. Another one of the names suggested for this game came from Kazuyuki Hoshino, the character designer for Sonic CD, and that name was Sonic Mania. Put another point on the board for Sonic Mania bringing back awesome obscure Sonic concepts that no one cares about. I guess the name Sonic Jam does kinda make sense, right? They're jamming all these classic Sonic games onto one disc like a mix CD, a jam you can rock out to. Apparently some lunatic actually made Sonic Jam, like jam you put on toast. Each character had their own flavor. Sonic was blueberry, Tails was marmalade, and Knuckles was strawberry. Supposedly these jars were just rotting away somewhere in Sonic Team's warehouse. Sonic Jam would be a rather straightforward Sonic collection featuring things you'd come to expect now, like artwork, videos, music, etc. But what makes this collection special is that all of the games were not just emulated like in many of the other Sonic collections. They were completely remade for the Saturn hardware. They included some new features too, like new difficulty modes that change up the level design. You can still play the original difficulty, which is basically the hard mode of the game. The last big thing this game offered was Sonic World. Instead of a boring menu, you have a hub world where you can run around as Sonic in a 3D environment. This was actually a prototype for Sonic Adventure that Sonic Team made. But since the Sega Dreamcast was coming out soon, they left the prototype for Sonic Jam and continued working on Sonic Adventure on the new system. This hub world isn't anything mind-blowing, but it is a cool proof of concept for what a 3D Sonic platformer could be like at the time. There were some other collections that included Sonic in them during this era, a lot of them made for Europe, like Sonic Compilation, Mega 6 Volume 3, and 6-Pack. But the most notable is Sonic and Knuckles Collection for Windows PCs, a compilation of Sonic 3, Sonic and Knuckles, Sonic 3 and Knuckles, and Blue Sphere, a collection of randomly generated Sonic 3 and Knuckles special stages which occurred if you put an incompatible game on top of a Sonic and Knuckles Genesis cartridge. Those who played Sonic Origins may recognize the music used for Carnival Night, Ice Cap, and Launch Bay Zone. as those songs that replaced the original versions used in Sonic 3 were first seen in this game. These new tracks originate from a Sonic 3 and Knuckles prototype before Michael Jackson and his team were brought in to compose for the game. There is one other thing included on the Sonic & Knuckles collection, and that is Sonic the Screensaver. This was only included in the North American and European releases of the collection. In Japan, this came out in the previous year, but you had to buy it separately. Sonic the Screensaver is, well, a bunch of screensavers for your computer. They've also got some icons for your programs and music too from the Genesis games and Sonic CD. Some of the artwork featured in this game is actually really cool. Apparently, Sonic goes grocery shopping, rides the bus, and drinks alcohol. He also looks like he's about to go on a date in this picture. He's all dressed up with a bow tie and a bouquet of flowers. Who's the lucky lady? Amy? Sally? Honey, maybe? A lot of this art came from Sega's internal newsletter magazine, Harmony, as well as calendars and Sega Freaks, a series of trading cards featuring various Sega characters and properties. Unfortunately, these cards were Japan exclusive. Though a lot of this art was in Sonic Jam too. But if you wanted to see Sonic drinking a cocktail in swim shorts, you were gonna have to pay up. We've made our way to the final game of 1997 and the last game in this awkward era of Sonic. Sonic R, released in November 1997, developed by Traveler's Tales, the same guys who worked on Sonic 3D Blast. Once again, Sonic Team would help with the game's development, handling game and course design while Traveler's Tales implemented everything. Sonic R is another Sonic racing game, although this time they actually used their brains and decided, yeah, Sonic's already fast, so let's make a Sonic racing game on foot. Coincidentally, Traveler's Tales were working on an engine for a new racing game, so when approached by Sega to make a Sonic racing game, it was a case of the stars aligning. Unfortunately, there's only 5 tracks in this game, most likely due to the incredibly short development time. They started working on the game in February of '97 and the game was released in November that same year, giving them only 8 to 9 months of dev time. Control-wise, the characters feel kinda stiff, probably because this was originally a regular racing game with cars, but you do get used to it after a while. Characters have special moves like Sonic's double jump and Knuckles' glide that help correct your movement in the air as well. It can actually be a lot of fun jumping around throughout the courses as there's a lot of freedom in terms of your movement. Of course, I can't talk about Sonic R without mentioning the music. Easily a top 5 Sonic soundtrack. This soundtrack has no skips. Even my favorite Sonic soundtrack, the Sonic CD Japanese OST, has a few tracks that I don't care for. But Sonic R, I love every song. Does this soundtrack fit a racing game? Yeah! People always say this music doesn't fit a racing game, but it definitely does. All of the music tracks for this game's courses are incredibly energetic and upbeat. Sure, it's not some ultra-fast, bass-bumping techno or drum and bass music, but I don't know, it gives off this feeling of freedom and carefree fun that I think fits the racing genre. Listen to Can You Feel the Sunshine with the windows down on a sunny day and tell me you don't feel the vibes. The composer for this game is the returning Richard Jakes from the Saturn version of 3D Blast. And on the vocals we have British singer TJ Davis. It was decided that this game would have actual singing in it, which of course was new for a Sonic game. While we did have some insert songs before, this was the first time it would be for the entire soundtrack. John Burton, head of Traveler's Tales and lead programmer for this game, actually considered cutting the vocals, but they settled on the ability to turn them off in the options menu. If you don't know who John Burton is, go check out his YouTube channel because he has a pretty great one. In fact, he has 2! He goes over tons of old Sonic prototypes as well as coding analysis videos if you're into the technical side of game development. One of the coolest things this guy's done though is make a ROM hack of his own game. Sonic 3D Blast Director's Cut is John Burton's attempt to fix many of the issues with the original version of Sonic 3D Blast on the Genesis. This update adds all sorts of quality of life improvements like a faster Sonic, better camera, and icons that show you where the flickies are on the map. But we've also got some really cool new features too, like a level select, a password system, and Supersonic. Talk about a labor of love, man. I would say hire the fans, but this guy made the original game, so I don't know, hire just people who are passionate. This game has its issues like its minimal content and somewhat stiff controls, but I do have a soft spot for this one, and I would love another on-foot 3D Sonic racing game. I specifically say 3D because we did actually get an on-foot 2D Sonic racing game in the Sonic Rivals series, which no one else besides me cares about, so I'll shut up now. But with Sonic R finished, we are now done with this era of Sonic. There were some other games like a Sonic Slot Machine and the Sonic 3D Blast LCD game, but I can't have anyone thinking I'm a nerd by talking about those games. Well, I guess there is one pretty important game that I haven't talked about. Sonic Extreme, an infamously unreleased Sonic game that was supposed to be the series' first 3D platformer, and the Sega Saturn's flagship Sonic title. But the amount of backstory, development issues, and its subsequent cancellation is another entire can of worms to open, so I'll leave that for a future video. This video is long enough as it is. So, what's the verdict? Is this the first dark age of Sonic? Is this an underappreciated, overlooked golden age of Sonic? Well, like I said, it's awkward. These games are weird, quirky, and dumb, but in an innocent way. There are some pretty bad games, not gonna lie, but there's also some really cool, innovative ones. They tried new things like a fighting game, an on-foot racer, games starring some of the secondary cast. And it's a shame they really haven't tried these ideas again. Sonic Battle is a fighting game, but it doesn't quite scratch the same itch as the more traditional Sonic the Fighters. And like I said before, we haven't gotten another 3D on-foot racer, and they've been very hesitant to even dabble into the side characters post-06. That's why I find this era of Sonic to just be so fascinating. It's the first time the Sonic series really felt like a full-fledged world with all of these different colorful characters who would largely disappear following the series rebrand in Sonic Adventure. So, for all intents and purposes, this era is essentially the filler arc of the Sonic timeline. Outside of the chaotics, the vast majority of this stuff would be tossed aside, only to be referenced in the occasional background poster. Sega themselves have largely forgotten about this phase in Sonic's history, as outside of a few collections from nearly 20 years ago, and releases on the Nintendo 3DS eShop, which, like I mentioned in my Super Mario Land video, is going to be offline soon, there are very few ways to play these games now. But hey, even though this time period may have just been filler to hold us over for Sonic's big 3D adventure, this is the only point in Sonic's history where you can play as Fang the Sniper, so it deserves to exist for that reason alone. I hope you guys enjoyed this video series. Please click the like button, it takes less than 5 seconds and it really helps the channel grow. If you want to see more videos like this, then please click the subscribe button too, it won't cost you a dime. Thanks guys, enjoy the quieter moments in life, and have a good one.